My name is Eliza Monroe. I am 34 years old. And I woke up in a hospital bed to find a stranger sitting beside me because my own mother chose not to come. The woman adjusted my IV and said softly, "I'm the night nurse they hired to stay with you." And the word hired landed harder than the pain in my chest. I tried to speak and managed only a rasp, asking where my family was, and she hesitated before saying, "Your partner is on his way." When I closed my eyes, the last voice I remembered hearing was my mother's, sharp and dismissive, saying, "Eliza always has something going on." Mark Bennett told me later how the call went while I was unconscious. How he said, "Linda, she's in the hospital. I need you here now," and waited through a silence that felt deliberate. My mother answered with a sigh and said, "She'll be fine. She always is." And in the background, he heard the rhythmic clatter of a casino floor bleeding through the line. He told her, "This isn't exaggeration. She could have died." And she replied, "You're overreacting," before hanging up. She added the sentence that would stay with me long after the painkillers wore off. "Alyssa never has these problems." When I woke fully, the nurse handed me my phone and a folded slip of paper that had been left on my tray. It wasn't a card from my parents or a message from my sister. Just a number written in careful ink and the words, "In case you need someone." I stared at it while my phone lit up with missed calls from Mark and none from home. The silence heavier than any accusation. That was the moment I understood something had shifted. Not because of the accident itself, but because of who did not show up when it mattered. It started with a phone call the week my first real paycheck cleared. When my mother said, "Eliza, I hate asking you this, but your father's health is slipping and the bills are piling up." I remember standing in my kitchen while she added, "We just need a little help until things stabilize." And when I asked how much, she said, $2,000 a month would keep us afloat. Before I could think it through, she lowered her voice and said, "Don't tell your dad. It would crush him to know we're struggling." I said yes because saying no felt unthinkable. The transfers became automatic. And so did the way she spoke about them. Like the money was part of the family's oxygen. When I asked once if things were getting easier, she said, "You know how expensive medications are." And then quickly added, "Alyssa's been so stressed lately. She needs stability." A year later, she called again and said, "We need to adjust a little. Costs are higher than we expected." And when I hesitated, she replied, "This is what families do for each other." I set the new amount without hearing a thank you. Only the click of the call ending. By the third year, the reasons came faster and with less detail, and the number rose again after a brief pause that felt rehearsed. She said, "The house needs work and your father can't handle repairs anymore." Then followed it with, "It's temporary. I promise." The way someone promises rain will stop. I asked if Alyssa could help, and my mother laughed lightly, saying, "She's still finding her way. You know how she is?" I told myself it made sense because it was easier than questioning the pattern. The money left my account each month, and the conversations shrank to updates and requests that assumed my agreement. When I mentioned cutting back once, she said, "After everything we've done for you, this shouldn't even be a discussion." And then reminded me, "Alyssa never asks for anything." I learned to measure my worth in reliability, in never missing a transfer, in not asking how the money was spent. Silence became my contribution on top of the payments. By the time Mark noticed the pattern, it felt older than any habit I could remember forming. He asked one night, "Do they ever ask how you're doing?" And I said, "They know I'm fine." Because that was the role I had accepted. When my mother called the next day and said, "We need to raise it again, just until things settle," I agreed before she finished the sentence. The system worked because it depended on me believing it had to. The first crack appeared on an ordinary night when I scrolled past Alyssa's post and saw her smiling on a beach with the caption, "Reset mode," while my phone still showed the transfer confirmation from earlier that morning. I stared at the image longer than I meant to. Hearing my mother's voice from the week before saying, "Things are tight again. Just for now." And the contrast wouldn't line up. When Mark glanced over and asked, "Isn't that your sister?" I said, "Yeah." She needed a break. Even as the words sounded rehearsed, he didn't argue. He just said, "From what?" and let the question hang. A few nights later, Mark brought his laptop to the table and said, "I'm not trying to interfere. I just want you to look at this with me." He turned the screen toward me and pointed, saying, "This is every transfer you've made." And the numbers stacked in a way I had never allowed myself to see. I started explaining, saying, "It's complicated. They need it. It's family." And he replied calmly, "I'm not questioning why you started. I'm asking why it never stops." When I told him, "They said it's temporary," he said, "Temporary doesn't usually last this long." The next call from my mother came right on schedule, and she opened with, "We're managing, but we could use a little more flexibility this month." I said, "I'm stretched thin," and she answered immediately, "We all are," before adding, "Alyssa's been under so much pressure. She doesn't need more stress." When I asked, "Where is the money actually going?" there was a pause. Then she said, "Why are you interrogating me like this?" The conversation ended with her saying, "I didn't raise you to be suspicious of your own family." After that, the silence between the calls felt louder than the requests themselves. Mark said one evening, "Have you noticed they never ask how you're holding up?" And I replied, "They assume I can handle it." Because that was the role I had always played. He nodded and said, "Handling it isn't the same as choosing it." And that sentence followed me into the next day. When the transfer went through again, I watched the confirmation linger on my screen longer than usual, knowing something had shifted even if I wasn't ready to name it. The night it happened felt routine until it didn't. The drive home quiet enough that my thoughts drifted to deadlines and the transfer that had gone through that morning. I remember gripping the wheel and thinking, "I'll call my mother tomorrow." And then the world folded in on itself with a sound I couldn't place. Someone shouted my name through the ringing, asking, "Can you hear me?" And I tried to answer, but my chest refused. The last clear thought I had was not fear, but the practical worry that I wouldn't be able to explain this one away. Mark told me later he got the call while he was still at work. The voice on the line saying, "There's been an accident. She's alive, but it's serious." He said he stepped outside and dialed my mother immediately, telling her, "Linda, Eliza's in the hospital. I need you here now," and waited through a silence that stretched. She finally said, "What kind of hospital?" And when he answered, she sighed and replied, "She'll be fine. She always is." As he tried again, saying, "They're running tests. She could have internal injuries." The faint clatter of slot machines came through the phone before she added, "You're making this sound worse than it is." While I drifted in and out, voices floated past me in fragments. A nurse saying, "Stay with us," and another asking, "Any family on the way?" I heard Mark's voice answer, "I'm coming as fast as I can." And then quieter, "Her mother won't come." Someone said my name again, and I felt a hand squeeze mine as if that alone could keep me anchored. In that space between consciousness and dark, the absence felt heavier than the pain. When I woke later, the room was still and unfamiliar. and a nurse said gently, "You're lucky." It was close. Before asking if I needed to call anyone, I croaked, "My mother knows." And she hesitated just long enough to tell me the truth without words. Mark arrived hours later, his face tight as he said, "I tried everything." And I believed him. Lying there, listening to machines hum, I understood that whatever system had kept my family together did not include me when it mattered most. I lay awake long after the room quieted, watching the light on the monitor pulse while Mark slept in the chair, his jacket folded on his lap. When he stirred and asked, "Do you want me to call your mom again?" I said, "No," and surprised myself with how steady it sounded. I picked up my phone and unlocked it, the banking app opening to a familiar screen that showed years of the same outgoing line. My thumb hovered as I remembered her voice saying, "This is what families do." And then I tapped through the settings without announcing it to anyone. The app asked me twice if I was sure, and the second time felt almost polite, like it expected hesitation. I whispered, "Yes," though no one needed convincing. And the confirmation appeared without ceremony. There was no rush of relief, no dramatic shift, just the absence of something that had been constant for so long it felt structural. When Mark woke and asked softly, "Did you do it?" I nodded and said, "I didn't tell them." And he answered, "You don't owe them an explanation." The next morning passed without calls, and the quiet stretched in a way that felt unfamiliar but not wrong. I checked my phone out of habit, half expecting a message that started with, "Why didn't it go through?" But nothing came. The silence told me more than any argument could have, because the system depended on my compliance, not conversation. For the first time, the decision existed without commentary, and that alone made it feel final. Richard Collins arrived without calling ahead, standing in the doorway with a worn leather folder tucked under his arm and saying, "I heard what happened, and I'm here now." I tried to sit up and he waved me back, adding, "Don't move. I'm not staying long, but we need to talk." When I asked, "How did you even know?" he answered, "Your partner called me when no one else showed up." He set the folder on the table and said, "I should have come sooner." He opened it and said, "These are your transfers." Flipping pages as if reading a familiar file. Every month, same dates, same pattern. I stared at him and said, "You went through my finances." And he replied evenly. I followed the money when the stories stopped making sense. When I asked, "How long have you known?" he said, "Long enough to recognize a system, not a crisis." His voice didn't rise when he added, "This wasn't help, Eliza. This was dependency." I tried to explain, saying, "They said they needed it. They said it was temporary." And he nodded once before replying, "That's what people say when they need compliance." He looked at me and asked, "Did they ever show you receipts or a plan?" And I shook my head. He closed the folder and said, "Then it was never about solving a problem." The quiet that followed felt deliberate, like he was waiting for me to catch up. When I asked, "Why didn't you stop it?" his jaw tightened, and he said, "Because I made the same mistake once and thought silence was neutrality." He went on, "I watched your mother do this slowly and convinced myself she would stop on her own." I said, "She didn't." And he replied, "No, she didn't. And that's on me too." He held my gaze and added, "I won't repeat that mistake." Before he left, he said, "I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I want you to know you're not wrong for ending it." I asked, "What happens next?" And he answered, "That depends on whether they can live without your money." He picked up the folder and said, I'll handle what needs handling on my end. As he reached the door, he turned back and said, "You deserved someone to show up. And I intend to." We met in Oregon in a small mediation office that smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. And my mother opened with, "I'm glad you finally agreed to talk like adults." I said, "I agreed to listen, not to reset anything." And she smiled as if that distinction was negotiable. She leaned forward and said, "We need to clear the air after all this drama." Using the word drama like it explained months of silence, I replied, "This isn't about air. It's about money." She waved a hand and said, "You're making it sound transactional." Then added, "Families don't keep score." I answered, "You kept score every month." And she shot back, "You offered. We never forced you." When I said, "You told me it was my responsibility." She shook her head and said, "I raised you to care." The room went still when I replied, "You raised me to comply." Alyssa crossed her arms and said, "This feels unfair. You cut us off without warning." And my mother nodded, saying, "That's the real issue here." I looked at them and said, "The real issue is that it stopped working." And Alyssa scoffed. "Working for who?" When I answered, "For you," my mother interjected, "Don't pit sisters against each other." I said, "You did that years ago." My mother softened her voice and said, "Let's be practical. Your grandfather is getting older and these things need planning." I asked, "These things meaning his will?" And she hesitated just long enough before saying, "Meaning fairness." Richard Collins, who had been silent until then, said, "Fairness doesn't require secrecy." And my mother replied sharply, "This is a family matter," he said. "It stopped being private when money replaced honesty." She turned back to me and said, "You don't even need the inheritance. You have Mark and your career." I answered, "This isn't about what I need." And she said, "Then help your sister." Pointing toward Alyssa, I said, "I already did. For years." And Alyssa muttered, "That was different." I looked at my mother and said, "This conversation is exactly why it's over." My mother's tone hardened as she said, "So you're just saying no?" Like it was a betrayal rather than a boundary. I replied, "Yes." And when she pressed, "After everything we sacrificed," I said, "No explanations." She stared at me and said, "You're choosing to tear this family apart." I answered, "I'm choosing to stop holding it together by myself." The mediator cleared their throat, but I stood and said, "I'm done here." Before anyone could redirect it, my mother said, "You'll regret being this cold." And I said, "I regret being quiet longer." Richard stood as well and said, "This meeting is over." And Alyssa looked between us as if the rules had changed without her consent. Walking out, I didn't feel victorious or cruel. Just finished. And for the first time, that was enough. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in updates that sounded smaller than they were. Like my mother saying on a voicemail, "We're just adjusting some things." And my father adding later, "Money's tighter than we expected." Mark listened as I played the messages and said, "They're learning what the budget actually was." And I knew he was right. A week later, Alyssa texted, "Do you know anyone hiring?" Followed by, "Anything entry level is fine." And I stared at the screen before replying, "Try the retail listings downtown." The conversation ended there, shorter than any request she had ever sent me. My father called one evening and said quietly, "Your mother's not taking this well." As if that explained anything. I asked, "Is she asking about the transfers?" And he paused before saying, "She's asking why you do this to us." I answered, I didn't do anything to you. And he sighed. I know, in a way that sounded like relief and grief tangled together. He didn't ask me to change my mind. And that absence felt intentional. Without the monthly deposits, their lifestyle compressed quickly. Not dramatically, but unmistakably, my mother complained. Everything costs more now. And I said, it always did. Which ended the call. Alyssa stopped posting photos and started sending short updates like, first day at work, without asking for help or praise. The distance shifted from hostile to practical. And that change felt permanent. Richard called to say, I've taken steps to make sure this doesn't repeat itself. And I didn't need details to understand what he meant. When Mark asked, do you feel bad? I said, I feel accurate. And he nodded like that made sense. The system hadn't collapsed out of spite. It collapsed because it no longer had a foundation. What followed wasn't revenge, just reality settling into place. The weeks after Oregon settled into a quieter rhythm. Not peaceful yet, but no longer sharp at the edges. Mark asked one morning, do you want to talk about them? And I said, not today, which felt like an honest answer instead of avoidance. We talked instead about small things, about work schedules and groceries, about plans that didn't require anyone else's approval. At night, when the house was still, I noticed how much space silence could hold when it wasn't filled with obligation. Richard started calling on Sundays. Never to ask questions, but to say, I'll be in town next month. Or, I found a book you'd like. When I thanked him for stepping in, he said, I didn't rescue you. I corrected my own delay. And that distinction mattered. My father checked in occasionally with, I'm trying to do better. And I answered, I see that. Without promising anything more, the conversations stayed brief and factual, which made them survivable. Healing didn't arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as clarity. The kind that shows up when patterns stop repeating. Mark said once, you seem lighter. And I replied, I'm just not carrying something that was never mine. I didn't miss the version of family that required silence and payment to stay intact. What I kept was simpler and steadier. A life built around choice instead of duty. And that felt like enough. Thank you for staying with my story and giving it your time. If something here felt familiar, I hope it reminded you that choosing yourself can lead to a quieter, steadier kind of peace. If you want to hear more stories about finding clarity and building a better life, you're welcome to stay.